Brad Bays. I'm in the geography department at OSU. And this is a course that I created about 12, 15 years ago. It had been on my mind for a long time before that. Um, uh, since my area of research involves historical geography, but also political geography, contemporary political geography, in regard to the land use that can be um, the types of land uses and restrictions on land uses associated with um, federal Indian trust land, reservations, um, restricted allotments, um, and other forms of tribal land, and other forms of land that is classified by the law as Indian country. All right. And that term is something I want to talk a little bit about eventually, and why it may not sound sort of socially acceptable anymore to use the term Indian to refer to Native American people or indigenous people, but it is a legal term that we can't really get around, and it's despite the fact that it may be it's not intended to be derogatory or offensive, but the fact of the matter is it's been used for so long that to change the wording would create um, ambiguity in the law. So um, that's that's the reason why that term continues to be used. But the other side of it is defining what we mean by that uh, is actually pretty complicated, and there are a lot of different caveats of there are a lot of different caveats when it comes to the lands that have a special status because of the presence of what is referred to as Aboriginal title, or what used to be referred to as Indian title. So a lot of different characteristics of that, and we're gonna focus on that. But in a lot of ways, this is an examination of what is referred to as the, the body of law in the United States that's called federal Indian law. And again, that's one of those terms that is unfortunate, but it's a legacy term to refer to it. So, for example, you can find primers, you can find examples of legal handbooks, and this is actually the sixth edition of and these are legal handbooks that are done for every environmental law, for family law, et cetera. There are dozens of these little handbooks, and this is on American Indian law, and this is the most recent publication, the most recent edition, but it's grossly out of date now. So hopefully it'll come along again. Um, the textbook that I've taught this class for a while, generally every year with a different book, and throughout all the years of doing this class, I've never really had a textbook, and that's been kind of unfortunate because it's kind of difficult to follow this with readings and other books. But finally, in 2020, um, a legal scholar and member of, I think he's a member of the Citizen Band Potawatomi, or maybe a Kansas Potawatomi group, guy by the name of Keith Richot, or maybe it's Richot, I guess, Jr., published this textbook, and this is a 30-chapter textbook that is intended to be a primer, sort of an introduction to federal Indian law and also United States Indian policy. And it's very historical in its approach, but it is intended for courses like ours, where we're not, these are, students in this class are not pre-law students. Generally, you may be pre-law, but certainly not law students, and so there's no it's not necessary to use textbooks or case books that maybe law students would read. Although you might find that you want to get into some of those, they're available in the library. But this textbook, even though it looks pretty thick, and it's about over 600 pages, a lot of this textbook is in the form of excerpts of federal statutes, of treaties, of executive orders, of agreements between Congress and tribes, as well as things like, and probably the most important thing that you'll read in here are Supreme Court opinions, Supreme Court briefs, and not even the entire brief in here. So it's not a long extended discussion of the case, but you'll see that those primary, what we would call primary documents, are very revealing. And what the author does here is he presents the material, presents the material that would be along the lines of a particular topic. So I'll just pick one at random here. The self-determination era. Okay, for example, in whatever American Indian policy history that you'll take, or American Indian history, you'll run across what's referred to as kind of the pendulum of American Indian policy, of U.S. Indian policy. And we can discuss, whether or not there's actually a pendulum, going back and forth. In other words, there's sort of there are eras in U.S. policy where American Indian tribes were sort of left alone to themselves to be autonomous, and then often very quickly the United States policy swings to a period in which the United States government has its nose in American Indian culture and is often trying to change American Indian people culturally, to assimilate and perhaps eliminate American Indian people as a distinct population of folks. So that pendulum, and then it swings back the other way occasionally. So we'll get into that, and the first third of the course is largely a review of those periods, those eras of American Indian history. And in the syllabus, if you've had time to read it, the first page or two that I've written, I wanted to put that in there just to explain that the United States Indian policy is nothing that it wasn't just invented in 1789 when the United States became a federal republic, when the Constitution was ratified. The United States Indian policy was evolving since at least 1607 when the British began colonizing Virginia, right? And sort of a lot of the concepts that emerged in those early colonial days are still with us. In fact, this whole idea of Indian country, that is a land that is recognized as the territory of Native Americans, that idea was vocalized during the days of Jamestown, when the Jamestown settlers were starving and were trying to initiate trade with the local group of Powhatan people. Initially, the trade existed, and the Native people helped them out, but then some bad things happened, and the settlers began getting desperate and raiding the Powhatan, with the result that the Powhatans attacked because they were far more numerically superior and powerful and knew the land. So the English began to establish a boundary. The English established a boundary around at first just a boundary across the peninsula where Jamestown was founded, and they called everything on the other side of the boundary Indian country. So they were carving out a territory that they were in control of, the Jamestown settlers, versus everything else. And we see the development of that idea throughout the colonial period. Not too long after the Jamestown settlements were really beginning to fail, the British Crown stepped in and took control of Virginia, made it a crown colony. And what that meant was that rather than simply a business venture, it would become an official colony of England. And so the idea there was that that began sort of a formalized relationship between the British Crown, between the British government, and native peoples. We'll talk about how that evolved, but there were plenty of treaties that were. I'm going to get me in front of this if that's okay, so I can. For some reason, I just feel like I'm driving still, But treaties were written throughout the colonial period. There were a lot of treaties between native peoples, I'll say tribes, and colonial governments. And typically, the British Crown reserved the right to deal with the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The British Crown reserved that right. Sorry, I'm forgetting that we've got people online too. The British Crown reserved that right to deal with them, and didn't want the colonial settlers to be dealing with them. The Crown didn't want to give authority to the people in the colonies to interact formally, legally, with the indigenous people. Why do you suppose that was the case? Generally, the local folks had very different goals and objectives in their dealings with native peoples. The British Crown, on the other hand, was interested in maintaining peace and perhaps maintaining the safety of its colonies, and sort of took a relationship that eventually the colonists began to really resent. We'll talk about how that worked out later. But the whole relationship between American settlers or American colonists and indigenous peoples became one of the important facets of the rebellion against King George, and that was especially the case in 1763 at the end of the 7 Years' War, what's referred to as the French and Indian War sometimes. At the conclusion of the war, you remember what happened in 1763? Who won that war? It was between the French and their native allies, and also some other parts of Europe, and the British and their few Indian allies. So what happened eventually was the British prevailed, and the French lost a large amount of territory, most of North America that they had colonized. They still claimed Louisiana. But the British, after 1763, wanted to maintain a separation between American Indian peoples, the indigenous peoples, and their colonies. The big problem was not, Indian raids against the white settlers as much as the white settlers raiding and essentially overstepping the boundaries and basically trespassing on the lands of the native peoples. So the Crown established this thing called the Proclamation Line. And the Proclamation of 1763 stated that no Englishman or English settler, white, whatever you want to call them, but subject of Great Britain, no subject of Great Britain could cross over the highest point in the Appalachian mountain chain. To do so would be to break British law, to encroach upon the Indian lands, the Indian country, and if not only was someone placing his life in his own hands by doing that, because the British Crown said you will not be protected if you cross that line, the British Crown even placed a penalty of death on anybody who did it. A lot of American colonists simply couldn't fathom that, and couldn't accept that. A lot of American colonists crossed that line anyway, but there was no way for the British to really enforce that policy. It was largely a matter of paper, and it was intended to maintain peace or maintain as much peace as possible between the British in the colonies and the indigenous peoples on the other side of the Appalachians. So what I'm trying to get at is this idea of Indian country has always been part of the history of the United States, or the history of Anglo-America and the colonization of North America by Europeans. It's always been a part of that. And the concepts remain in place. Might also mention that the British, and to a degree the Dutch, had a very different approach, and the French certainly had a very different approach toward the Aboriginal people of North America compared to, say, the Spanish, or in South America, the Portuguese. The Spanish had had a very interesting sort of intermarriage with native peoples wherever they settled. At the same time, they weren't the Spanish weren't so concerned with not taking land by conquest. And this is a big difference between the way that the United States initiated its Indian policy and the way, say, for example, France in New France operated its Indian policy. The British wanted a separation of people, generally. But at the same time, the British tried to do things, they tried to expand and acquire native lands in a way that placed land into a formalized economy. And once the American Revolution had passed, once the United States was born and inherited the claims of Great Britain to the eastern part of North America, something we'll talk about a little bit later here. Once that happened, the United States not only inherited everything that the British had, sort of inherited that legacy of the British interaction, the sort of distinctive British interaction with native peoples. The Americans inherited a sort of a conscience, in a way. They inherited a conscience of or establishing a clear title to the land that they acquired from native peoples. And that's really where the idea of Indian country is derived. Okay, the idea is that, and I tried to state this in writing on the syllabus as I was kind of reviewing, how to start the course. And the way that worked was that there was this sort of abstract idea that the land that was possessed by native peoples, the land that was in control of a native group, if you want to call them a tribe or a clan or maybe a town in the southeast. Uh, this native group controlled some land. That was clear. Often the land was in dispute among native peoples. There's no question about that. Often it was in dispute among several groups. But one thing that had to happen was a recognition of someone. And so the United States recognized a group of people who had claim to it, or at least the most powerful group of people who had claim to it. And so they established this pattern or tradition of saying this group owns this parcel of land. Just like in Europe, you might say, well, this parcel of Europe is called Luxembourg, or this parcel of Europe is now called Serbia. Okay, so the idea that there was a group of people owning the land was the first kind of fiction that was part of this whole process, or rolled up into this process. The other part of that was that, so once a native group is recognized as existing and having claim to this land, that allowed negotiators to somehow acquire that land from that group of people. So what is recognized by the Americans, by the federal government, was that the land is in possession, and to take that land, we have to have a formal cession of land. That cession has to come from a treaty, and typically that treaty would have some sort of compensation for the land. Okay? Didn't always happen, of course. The Black Hills is a good example of that, and we'll read about the Black Hills. But the idea that somebody owned the land, when the United States recognized ownership, regardless of whether it was true or false or sort of true, if there were 3 or 4 people fighting over that land, the United States said this group owns it. And for this group to own it then opened up the possibility that the United States could acquire it by working with that group. The idea that the native peoples possessed it became, or sort of evolved into, an idea known as original Indian title, what is today referred to as Aboriginal title. But we'll stick with the old term. The original Indian title was not a title. Eventually this would be ironed out by Chief Justice John Marshall beginning in 1823 and ending about 1832. It's something called the Marshall Trilogy of Supreme Court cases. I don't know how many John Marshall schools there are in Oklahoma, but I know there's one in Oklahoma City or the Village. John Marshall High School and John Marshall Elementary School. John Marshall, a lot of people don't know who John Marshall was, but he was probably the most important Chief Justice in United States history. Certainly brought the Supreme Court into a degree of importance that it hadn't enjoyed until after Marshall. Marshall had really everything to do with shaping the early development of United States Indian policy and sort of the terms of Indian country. Okay? Marshall interpreted this idea that when a group of people is identified as possessing the land, what they own is not similar, or at least according to Marshall's interpretation. What they own is a right to use that land, a right of use, a right to support their living, a living of a nation of people. Okay? All right, I'll get into the ideas of nations and states in a little bit. But it was largely defined early on in U.S. history, prior to the Indian Removal Act. And we've been working with the same ideas all the way through. The idea that, say, for example, maybe some of you own your own vehicle, or maybe you own your own home, or like me, the bank really owns it, but you're working on it, okay, working on owning it. So in the case of real estate that you own, like your house where you live, or your personal property like a computer or a car, an automobile, if you own that, um, if you own that property, what rights do you have to that property? Well, if you own your own vehicle, nobody's going to really, you're not going to get in trouble. You're not going to have a problem with the law if you take a sledgehammer and go out and whack the windshield and bust the windshield in your vehicle, right? If your insurance company learns about that, they're not going to like it, but you're not going to get reimbursed for it. So, you can do whatever you want to with your own personal property. You can destroy it, whatever. That's your own right. In the case of real estate, the type of real estate that we're used to um, as property owners is that if you own a home in let's say a suburban subdivision of some city like Tulsa, maybe you have a house in Broken Arrow or something, um, and you've paid that house off and you own it outright, you don't have a mortgage on it. What do you actually own? How would you describe your property rights? What are the property rights to your home? Are you required to? Can you sell it to someone else? Certainly. If the price is right, you can certainly sell it. You could destroy the house and maybe build a new house. It's the property that your ownership uh, reflects is a use of the surface of that property. And if you own it, then you have a right, as long as our properties, our system of property law is in place and it's not threatened by an outside force of some sort. As long as you own that property, you can when you get old, you might pass that property on down to your daughter, okay, or to your child or your grandchild. We can do that, right? This is a type of property ownership that we refer to basically as fee simple property, fee simple title to the property. Um, if you own a home, is it possible for you to drill a gas well on your property and then uh, benefit from the production of oil and gas on your property? That's a little different, right? What do you have to own if you want to exploit the subsurface minerals?
Mineral rights.
Yeah, you have to own you have to own the mineral rights, or you have to lease the mineral rights. Somebody owns the mineral rights. In most cases, if you're talking about suburban Tulsa, people own the surface rights only, and mineral rights are often held by families who received them generations ago. And maybe they're split up in all sorts of divisions of heirs. So the surface rights are different from the mineral rights. What about the space above your property, the surface of the earth? Theoretically, you have the rights to that, but you can't stop the passage of aircraft or anything like that simply because you own that property, right? So that's common sense. But the point of the matter is that you can pass your property on to successive generations, or you can sell it, you can improve it, you can destroy it, whatever you want to do, because the property is in fee simple. And that is very different from what John Marshall referred to as, or what John Marshall worked to interpret as Indian title, original Indian title. So what would Indian title? How would Indian title be different? Well, we'll get into all this, but these are the sorts of questions that we have to look at. In the case of Indian title, the interpretation that Marshall gave was that this was a right to use the land in a sort of a degree or a sense that sort of locked in time when the United States recognized a possession, not an ownership, but a possession of the land. So native peoples who live on land with Indian title, and there's not a lot of that anymore, but there's a lot of trust land, a lot of land that has been acquired by the United States federal government, by us. Okay, I say the federal government, but in the United States, the sovereign is not the king, right? The sovereign is not the monarchy. The sovereign is what? The sovereign is, you want to take a stab at it, sir? Who is the sovereign in the United States? Here's a clue, here's a hint. What's the preamble of the United States Constitution? We the people of the United States. So the sovereign is popular. We have popular sovereignty. The sovereignty is with all the people who are citizens of the United States. Citizens. And so how do we make decisions if we're all sovereign? Well, we have these representatives in these institutions called Congress, the House, the United States House of Representatives especially, and the United States Senate, and we have the president. So the Congress then is representing the popular sovereignty of American citizenry. And for that reason, Congress has really the exclusive authority to interact with nations of people who were indigenous, and at first, until about the late 1800s and 1924 in many cases, native indigenous peoples of North America and their descendants were not even considered American citizens. They were considered aliens for, in some sense, they were considered aliens, which is bizarre, isn't it? But those nations of people can only be interacted with in a formal way between our sovereign and their sovereign. So the United States people, represented by Congress, Congress has exclusive authority to interact and make deals with and negotiate with the nations of the indigenous peoples. And I want to make clear that I don't mean someone who is an enrolled member of the Chickasaw Nation. An enrolled member of the Chickasaw Nation is not a nation of people. The enrolled member of the Chickasaw Nation is represented by the Chickasaw Nation. Only the Chickasaw Nation and Congress can interact. That's what this class is all about. Our class is not really so much about individual people, although the cases that we will read about are often based on the story of people, of individuals and families, and it's in that sense it's a very humanistic class. It's a class where you'll learn a lot of interesting things about a lot of different indigenous peoples. A lot of the great variety of people of indigenous extraction in the United States. So Congress and nations, the Indian nations, are interacting to produce this thing that we can call federal Indian law and policy. At the same time, what else can we say about that? Oh, yeah. Um, Steve, I'll ask you this question, okay? Um, what the United States is we call it a federal republic, right? It's a federal state, and there are two types. There often it's often classified. There are two types of states in the world. Um, there are federal states, and there are what are called sometimes unitary states. A unitary state is a country where there's not where there can certainly be regional divisions, but um, basically the central government is the government, and the sovereignty is there's only one sovereign within the country. In the case of the United Kingdom, it's still the monarchy is the so-called sovereign, but basically the government decision making takes place between the legislative branch, the House of Commons, House of Lords, and the Prime Minister. Okay, so the it's a democracy, but it's a unitary state. Um, Another example would be France. Both of these are strong democracies, but they are not federations. They're not federal states. Federal state is one in which you have a central government, but you also have regional governments, and those regional governments, at least in theory, have sovereignty over things happening within their boundaries. So in the United States, right? So what are the two sovereigns in the United States? You can imagine.
So,
Or what are the two levels of government?
um, they would be the federal and then the state,
Federal.
state government
Yeah.
for each.
So you're a citizen, right?
Right.
You're a citizen of Oklahoma, I'm guessing. So you're a citizen of Oklahoma, and you're a citizen of the United States. Right? So American Indian people, the only group of people in the United States who have three levels of sovereignty. They're citizens of the United States, citizens of the state, and also citizens of a tribe or tribal government or nation. So three different sovereigns. So sometimes people refer to this as a compound republic. You have different levels. Most federations just have two levels. Switzerland is a very strong federation where the regions, the cantons, are very very strong. And when you go to Switzerland, you'll notice this that unlike maybe in France or Sweden, where you will see the national flag, or the United States, we see the American flag everywhere, much more commonly than you would the state flag. Um, in Switzerland, it's just it's the other way around. You rarely see the national flag of Switzerland, um, the white cross on the red field, but you see the canton flags everywhere because they represent they really call themselves a confederation state. So the point of that is American Indian people themselves live under three different sovereigns if they're citizens of a tribe or tribes. Um, so these are the types of things that we'll get into in the class. I didn't really mean to jump into great ideas, and these are important ideas. Let me leave you with one thing before we get into the syllabus, okay? Um, you know what Indian country is pretty much, right? Federally or federal Indian trust land that has been allotted from reservations or other things that remain in federal trust or at least restricted from sale. Okay, those uh, those things provide this land that we call trust land or Indian country of some sort. Indian country can also include something called um, uh, dependent Indian communities, which is kind of a strange concept. It can also include things like pueblos in New Mexico, urban conglomerations of people. so we have an idea of what Indian country is. It's not an enormous proportion of the total area of the United States, that's for sure. But it's not static. It's not created once and then, you know, disappears over time. It sometimes is revealed, okay, and it can have very real consequences. Um, in Oklahoma, we should know this. All right, there was I'll say, you know, the author of this textbook, he did a great job at the textbook, but he published it about a month or two early. So it came out, I don't know when in 2020, fairly early in 2020. But there was a very consequential case. What's it called?
The criminal one here.
The McGirt versus Oklahoma case that went to the Supreme Court. And in that finding, the United States, well, I don't know what it was, 5-4. I'm not sure what it was. Maybe it was a little bit more than that. But it was 5-4.
It was pretty tight.
Pretty close, yeah. So 5 or 6 people in the United States decided this, and that is what?
That tribal people, their jurisdiction lies within their reservation, and they shouldn't be tried on.
Well, yeah, the argument, that's actually a very old concept that we'll talk about and when we get to crime. Something called the Major Crimes Act that was passed, you know, back in 1880s. The Major Crimes Act essentially took away the right of American Indian tribal entities, what we would call tribal government today. It took away the right of tribal governments to prosecute and punish criminals within a Native American tribal criminals within their own tribe on their own land when the crime was on their own land. It took away that right. Major Crimes Act took away that right. Congress took that right away because what Congress said was, we can't really trust the Native peoples to do things the right way. So they took that away. Okay, it actually followed a really significant Supreme Court ruling called Ex parte Crow Dog, and that was a ruling in which it was found that Native American tribes have every right to prosecute criminals within their own tribe who commit crimes on their land against members of their own tribe. So it's completely contained within their own world, but and the Supreme Court said, well, you know, they have all the right to do that. And Congress, 2 years later, or a year and a half later, said, we can't allow that. So they passed the Major Crimes Act. The Major Crimes Act then says, following from John Marshall, the Major Crimes Act says that serious crimes, that is, violent crimes generally, murder, rape, kidnapping, armed robbery, you know, etc. You know, not just speeding or, you know, maybe even larceny, but those serious violent crimes are outside the jurisdiction of American Indian tribal governments, outside of their jurisprudence jurisdiction. All right, so and we know also after many cases that those crimes are not the purview when a native perpetrator, we'll say a tribal perpetrator against a tribal victim on Indian land, on tribal land, that is not the purview of a state. States have nothing to do with that. It has to be a federal investigation and a federal conviction and a federal sentencing. Okay, so it's the purview of the United States federal government, not the states. So that's where that case derived from, and you know the violent crime, which was awful, and I'm not contesting the verdict that the state gave, um, and I'm not, I'm not contesting it or I'm not supporting it. Um, Regardless, if the crime that was committed was actually committed, and there was nothing wrong with the procedures or the evidence in the trial of this man. Um, the only thing that was wrong that we know of is what? The jurisdiction. So, what was sentenced to death? Okay, and so this man was sentenced to death for his crimes, but that death sentence was handed down by the state of Oklahoma, and so he made the argument that, or his lawyers made the argument that that crime was committed in Indian country, not in the state of Oklahoma. It was in Indian country, and it was it involved tribal members. So it was occurred on Indian land. So therefore, remember, the point was that the argument was that it was made that the crime took place on Indian land. The state said no, it didn't take place on Indian land. It took place within the former boundaries of the Creek Nation. So the whole argument was whether or not the Creek Nation was ever, and this is a term that you'll run into later on down the line, called whether or not the Creek Nation was disestablished. Okay, it's kind of a redundant term, but in other words, the Creek Nation was never completely dissolved. It actually exists. That doesn't, even though it hasn't been recognized by the state of Oklahoma for 120 years or more, we're now saying that, oh yeah, there was never any evidence to disestablish, to say that the Creek Nation had been completely wiped out, completely eliminated. And the only reason that argument could be made was because of other Supreme Court cases that have taken place in places like Nebraska and South Dakota. And the whole term of disestablishment is a legal theory or concept that arose from those disputes, from those other cases. So what I'm saying is the law develops, and it's referred to as discovery. We're discovering these things in the law. So it was discovered that there's this thing called disestablishment, and they came up with a legal test for it, sort of a test that says, okay, well, this is the point to which there's a disestablishment. And that legal test was developed. That legal test was applied to the Creek Nation, and turns out that according to that legal test, the Creek Nation was never dissolved, disestablished. And if the Creek Nation was never disestablished, neither were any of the other four nations of eastern and southern Oklahoma, which means that eastern and southern Oklahoma are now, whatever you want to think, in the eyes of the law and the courts, Indian country. Okay? Does that have what sort of ramifications does that have? Well, initially, the Supreme Court said, basically, well, y'all will work it out somehow, because the state of Oklahoma has long been working with tribal police forces, light horses, etc., to cross-deputize people, cross-deputize officers, so that there's not an issue of jurisdiction when, say, let's say an Okmulgee County sheriff's deputy who is not a Native American needs to arrest someone who is a citizen of the Creek Nation on Creek land, or on an allotment, okay, a restricted allotment. There's not a problem of jurisdiction that's going to throw the whole case out, okay? And so the Creek Nation cross-deputizes them, and also it's a very important facet of rural law enforcement now in Oklahoma for the county sheriff's office to cross-deputize American Indian police officers. That's been a lifesaver in counties like Push-Matahala County, Push County, in southeastern Oklahoma. Huge county, very small population density, part of the Choctaw Nation. And if you have, and there's just a handful of deputies in Push-Matahala County, and if there's a say there's a burglary in progress 40, 50 miles away in a mountainous county, and the closest person is like 30 miles, closest county deputy is 30 miles away. Well, there might be a tribal light horse, I don't know what Choctaws call them, tribal police officer, 5 miles away. So that cross deputization has saved a lot of these counties from having to hire lots and lots of personnel. It makes a lot of sense. Cooperation among governments is all we're talking about.
Does that have the possibility then of leading into, let's say, property rights and everything else? Like this would be, to me, would be the cornerstone of actually snowballing down into other different areas of the law.
Well, it's not going to affect fee simple property whatsoever. Okay. Basically, if you own your own home and you're not an American Indian person, you're not you don't hold a certificate of degree of Indian blood, and it doesn't really matter. Even someone with a certificate of degree of Indian blood can own a house over in Broken Arrow. That doesn't make it Indian land. Okay, that doesn't make it Indian country. That has really nothing to do with it. So it's not going to affect your property rights. However, there's a big problem that hasn't really come out in the press so much yet. And that is, it throws into question all of the regulatory agencies in the state of Oklahoma that have regularly done business or operated within the counties that make up the old Indian Territory. Right? Because now, regulatory, like civil regulatory work of a state, that doesn't typically operate within Indian country. Okay, so, and I've experienced this myself. I work for a state agency. And typically, as part of my job at OSU, I do contract work for a state agency out of Oklahoma City that has forever the purview of the entire state of Oklahoma. They're funded by a national, the Department of the Interior, and they operate to do regulatory work across the state in every county. And I've often worked for them. That's a good thing. I had bid for a project in southeastern Oklahoma, which would be entirely within the Choctaw Nation, and the state agency wrote me and said, your proposal was great, but we can't get funded for that yet. We're not sure where we are in terms of our authority over southeast Oklahoma. So, yeah, that's right. Now it's the Choctaw Nation's purview, the Choctaw Nation's prerogative to do that regulatory work within their boundaries. So it could have, and that's just one little agency, regulatory agency, that now is saying, I think our territory has been halved, and that means maybe perhaps our employee base needs to be halved. And over in Choctaw Nation, they might be saying, hey, we've got this whole area. We need federal money to support our regulatory agency for this large area. So in a lot of things, and there are dozens and dozens of possible agencies like that, regulatory agencies, water, whatever. So Indian, this idea, a class on Indian country has a heck of a lot of relevance in the state of Oklahoma, particularly. Um, but I think you'll find that it's an interesting and often contradictory body of law, and it's pretty fascinating. So, in that sense, I've been talking for almost an hour. Um, I think maybe we can take a quick break. My contact information is right up here. Um, Try to do this for everybody. The contact information uh, is I would prefer if you could just email me directly from your. I don't care if it's really from your OSU email account or Gmail or whatever you like to use. Um, but please email me when you need to contact me at bbays@oakstate.edu. I've tried to use Canvas's inbox, and I've had problems for years with this. Today I wrote a long, the email that I sent you earlier? I had written that all out. It was a great letter. It took me a while to get everything down, and I went to send it on Canvas, and it just disappeared. Or maybe I hit escape or something like that, and the whole thing just disappeared. So um, please, I really have trouble with that module inbox. But if you could just email me directly, I'd appreciate that. When you need to contact me, if you need if you're unable to use email all the time, just let me know, and you're welcome to have my cell number. Also, I should probably just put it on here too. Um, but I'm going to have some online office hours, which we'll do through Zoom, which is what you see here. Here's your classmate Sarah there, and the basically I have how you have a personal meeting room or something like that on Zoom. Y'all, I'm assuming everybody's used Zoom now. Um, the My Zoom personal meeting or whatever that is, what would that be? Anyway, that number is right there. So if you have Zoom, or you can just click on the link, and that'll take you right to my sort of space on Zoom, and I will have that open at 5 o'clock on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So if you need to discuss something, you can always just kind of wait for that. Now the other thing is you're always welcome to just email me, and we can set up a Zoom meeting right there and do it whenever you need to. Or if you just need to talk on the phone, I'm happy to talk on the phone with you. And we were talking about, what is Indian country? And in fact, Congress defined it. I don't know if you can't see that, I guess, but Congress defined Indian country in 1948. And it involves about three different things. Essentially, reservation land, and then these dependent Indian communities, which are sort of hard to define, and then Indian allotments taken out of reservations um, that are still in federal trust and therefore not taxable, or just not taxable. They've been ruled to be non-taxable. So we were discussing during the break the idea that the American Indian people or tribes, excuse me, the Indian tribes are recognized or mentioned 3 times in the United States Constitution. And keep in mind, it's not Native people; it's Indian tribes, it's nations, the other nations that are within the boundaries of the United States. And every time it has something to do with taxes or counting population. American Indians were specifically not counted as part of the population. Slaves, as you know, were counted as 2/3, right? 2/3 of that was the compromise. Anyway, so American Indians were um, targeted as not counting toward the population. And the others are native tribes are referred to as the Indians not taxed because they're not represented, right? They're not represented by Congress, therefore, no taxation, no representation if you're not taxed. So, anyway, I talked a little bit about this British legacy, the centrality of Indian country to federal Indian law. Hopefully, I made a case for that. The learning material in here is going to be made up of my presentations, which will typically follow the textbook. That's my goal, is to follow the textbook. And I've gone through every chapter in this textbook, and in every single chapter, Indian country, land, that's what we study in geography, land or space or communities, is central to the understanding of the topic and the subject. It's always there. Land is always there in the relationship between the United States government, or even state governments, and American Indian tribal governments or Indian nations. So I'll lecture on the subject that is covered in that chapter, and we're going to try to cover about 3 chapters per class meeting. The class meeting prior to an exam, we'll have 3 of those. We're going to have 3 exams. The exams are all weighted the same, but the class period preceding the class period with the exam will only cover 1, except for the last where we cover like 4. But hopefully we'll kind of get ahead of ourselves. We'll see what happens. But I want to have a little bit of some time for a review prior to the first 2 exams at least, and we'll try to have a review for the second or the 3rd exam also. So learning material, we've got the textbook. I think I must have put a heading over the. Oh, okay, yeah. I was going to cover that later, but I'll cover it now. In the letter that I sent out to you earlier today, I said I was going to mention something about the 5 ways or the 5 shapers of American Indian law, and those are listed right here. They include the United States Constitution. Actually, we usually don't count the Constitution. That's actually kind of a 6th, but basically the Constitution, and that's going to be enforced by the United States Supreme Court, right? Indian treaties. The Constitution and Indian treaties are considered, and also federal statutes, are considered the law of the land. In fact, Indian treaties have no less authority than the United States Constitution when it comes to their finality. Federal statutes are often found to be unconstitutional, and those federal statutes, are repealed. What is a federal statute? Well, that's just what we refer to as legislation. So that's federal legislation. That's a law that's passed by Congress. Starts as a bill, becomes a law, and then it has to be signed by the president to become a law. So there are lots of federal statutes. One is that Major Crimes Act we were talking about. It's a federal statute. And this means that Congress, the United States Congress, has what we refer to as plenary authority or plenary power, Plenary, plenary power. That's pretty much ultimate supreme power over American Indian tribes. In theory, Congress could meet and just decide that all American Indian tribes no longer exist, all right, and it would have the authority to do that. It'll never happen, of course. It'd be incredibly unpopular, and lots of people would be voted out of office. But that's, in theory, that's the case. So Congress has ultimate authority. Congress, in one way, although the United States inherited this relationship with the indigenous nations from the British did things a little different. The British didn't need to answer to its people. The British Crown could make decisions that the people on the ground didn't necessarily agree with. And of course, we know what happened in the American colonies with that. But the British Crown attempted to make policy that was maybe long-term and in the best interest of the long-term British Empire. In our system, however, it's democratic, and the will of the people is not always consistent, we'll say, all right? The will of the people tends to fluctuate, and we see what?
It's not always long term.
It's not very long term often, yeah. So the will of the people brought the the first Democratic president, Andrew Jackson, to office, and Andrew Jackson rode into the White House on the promise that he was going to get a law passed that would remove Native peoples from the southeastern United States. It would clear the title to the land for those who wanted to open it up to farming cotton. So the Indian Removal Act was one of those examples of the will of the people affecting Indian policy. And we see this a lot. So, we're taught, of course, that democracies are the best system of all, right? And here's an example where you might want to think twice about that, at least when you're dealing with indigenous folks. All right. So we've got the Congress with this plenary power. But Congress is not the only body that can make quick changes to federal law. Presidents can also through executive orders. What's the difference between an executive order and a statute, a federal statute law? Federal statute law is permanent as long as it's not repealed. And it can be repealed, or it can be found to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Executive orders can be, and you probably know this because President Trump did a lot of things that were immediate through executive order, just like President Obama did a lot of things through executive order, especially toward the end of the presidency, that were immediately repealed once the change in office took place. So Trump trashed a lot of Obama's executive orders, and now Biden is now trashing a lot of Trump's executive orders. So they're out when the party is, or when the president is out. Not necessarily even the same party or the different party. So we have executive orders. I'm kind of going in a particular order if you haven't noticed. After executive orders are what I consider to be the most sinister of all the shapers of American Indian law and policy, and that is the administrative rule. Okay, what would that mean? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Administrative rules. And we'll see some horrible examples of how administrative rules were affected Native peoples. Administrative rules are those, they're basically policies or the rules that are established within federal agencies like the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or perhaps the uh, Indian Health Service, or some other federal agency, and they are enacted typically just within that agency. They're not subject to a democratic process. They're not subject to um, the checks and balances of our executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. So they happen all the time, and they are typically, and they're really just as consequential. Administrative rules are just as consequential as federal statutes, executive orders, or even treaties in some cases. Fortunately, the Supreme Court often catches them, or Congress will catch them and change the rules. Uh, but in the 19th century, there were a lot of administrative rules that did some horrible things in Indian country, or in, as your textbook author refers to it, Native America. I like that term, referring not just to the land but also to the people. All right, so those are the 5 sort of basic shapers of policy and law. Um, the scope of our course, well, the way you can think of it is take a course in American Indian Studies, all right, and a multidisciplinary type of course, and marry it to a course in geography, all right, because I'm a geographer first. Um, my interest in academic interest has always been Native American geography. But this course tries to marry concepts in geography, and especially political geography. It's a subfield of geography. And there's even there's a field now that's referred to as legal geography, which is really right on what this is. Legal geography with American Indian studies, and largely American Indian history. So I hope you don't mind getting a lot of history. You will in this. That's just necessary. You can't get around the history, but you don't have to. You're not going to have to do a lot of the same sort of studying that you would in a history course. Um, so that's kind of where we're coming from. There are other sources other than the textbook that I'll introduce you to, especially as you start doing research. There are a lot of academic journals that cover this sort of topic. Certainly, American Indian Studies journals. There are other published things like I mentioned the Canby Handbook of American Indian Law. Really good. It's it's sort of like it's remember Jack Webb on Dragnet? Probably, I'm probably the oldest one. Remember Dragnet? Just the facts, man. Okay, so just the facts. It's not fun to read. It's just the facts. So facts of the cases. There are also some really good websites that I'll link, like the Cornell Law School website that provides a nice introduction to the legalese that we'll need to get around in the course. So I had in mind to talk a little bit about some of these terms that will pop up. You'll see things like jurisdiction a lot. You probably know what that means, but other things like a writ of habeas corpus, a writ of certiorari. I can never pronounce it. Um, um, there are a number of legalistic types of terms that you'll need to understand just to know what they mean, to understand the story and how things operate. You'll need to understand in the course um, the the federal court system. That's really important because in um, uh, we don't need to know so much about tribal courts, but we'll talk about them in one chapter. But state courts are really not something we need to know too much about. But you probably already know a little bit about the way the state judiciary systems work. In the federal judiciary, you have three levels. At the trial level, a federal trial court is in basically a federal district court. And those federal district courts typically are associated with large metropolitan areas, sections of state, several states in the western states. So the federal district courts are where the cases will originate typically. And then what happens is if a case is, if someone loses a federal case, but yet they have a good argument to appeal it, they have to be taken on appeal by the appeals court. And the appeals courts in the federal system are what are referred to as the circuit courts. So there are federal circuit courts. Those are the appeals courts. If a case like the McGirt versus Oklahoma case, it didn't go through the appeals process. It went directly to the Supreme Court, I believe. But basically, at the federal level, the case would originate in a trial court at the district level. If it's a successful appeals, if it gets an appeal, it goes to the federal circuit courts, and there are just a few of those. Those are regional. In Oklahoma, I believe, anybody know where we would go? I think it's Denver. If it's not Denver, it's New Orleans. Is it Denver? I think the circuit court is Denver for us. So, and then of course, after the appeals court is the ultimate decider, and that's the United States Supreme Court, which takes very, very few cases. And the majority of those cases are not even discussed by the court. Just about a couple hundred, I think, a year are really actually debated and discussed, and where a lawyer would actually make an argument. So that system is something you need to understand a little bit. Okay, and I make a few comments about, well, this is, unfortunately, a lot of people have, sometimes people enroll in the class thinking, okay, we're going to learn about different cultures. And I don't want to say you won't, because you actually will learn some very interesting things about different groups, different tribal groups. And there's a huge variety, huge universe of culture, but culture is not really our purview. It's going to be part of what we'll learn about, but it's not the focus. It's not the objective of the course. Okay, so you'll have the textbook. I've already talked about that. You've got 30 chapters. Sounds like a lot, but it's really not that much. It's a fast read, and the excerpts are taken pretty selectively, and I'll try to direct you to a little bit more than what the textbook does to what is the most important part of this. Okay, so any questions over the textbook or anything? We're gonna probably, if there's anything that is just doesn't have much of a territorial focus, and there I can think of maybe a few examples, like perhaps child custody, divorce. Usually doesn't have a lot to do with land, but if we get in a pinch for time, we might cut a few items. But in every chapter, there's usually something that is pretty much dependent on territory and place and land and stuff. So please, if you would, when you get a textbook, go ahead and just kind of peruse through it, because I'm going to ask you to find a subject or topic within the textbook that is of your interest. And we're going to try to develop a research paper question or research topic for your paper from those topics. And it, it may surprise you how geographical some of the topics actually are. Um, uh, Things like religion. You wouldn't think so much. How can American Indian religion and the how would federal Indian law that affects American Indian religious practices, how would that be geographical? In fact, it can be incredibly geographical uh, when it comes to practicing um, practicing traditions, because place is almost always associated with traditions, and then we can even go to things like cultural um, resources, um, and what we refer to as repatriation. Um, I live in Stillwater, and we have a lot of folks in Stillwater and surrounding area, Pawnee, who are members of the Pawnee tribe. Pawnee tribe originated, I think they were around this area back in the late 1700s, but um, when they were contacted by the French and the Americans, the Pawnee lived mostly in Nebraska, and um, there are still, and the Pawnees, of course, removed um, to what became Oklahoma and Pawnee County area um, in the 1870s, 1880s. Um, but I'm telling you, there are many, 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 many Pawnee, or at least there was, at the University of Nebraska. I went to the University of Nebraska. That's where I did a PhD. And you didn't see the Pawnee people at the University of Nebraska. You know what I'm getting at, Sarah? Any idea? Sort of? Most of the Pawnee people at the University of Nebraska, until recent decades, most of the Pawnee people at the University of Nebraska were in drawers in the museum. Okay? They were skeletons and remains that were excavated by archaeologists in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Because they were Indians, they didn't they did not have the same protections of graves as everyone else in the United States. However, that changed with the Native American Graves Protection, Graves and NAGPRA. Okay, I'm just going to say NAGPRA, um, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Okay, which requires now that remains held by museums, often in drawers in the basement, are returned to the tribe that they are affiliated with or associated with, and those are often in, put in burials. So anyway, religion and place, religion and remains, for goodness sakes. There are that's one of those regulatory things that tribes are now involved with, is using things like ground penetrating radar to locate lost graves and lost burial sites, so that they can be protected and preserved, um, uh, because they haven't even been recognized. So anyway, sacred spaces are important. All right, I'm going to try to speed up a little bit here. The organization of the course is going to be along the lines of basically in thirds. We're going to have 3 exams, and each one of those exams will cover 10 units, 10 chapters, plus whatever I got in today. And I'm actually going to give you a little bit of an assignment tonight, so it's going to include that also. Um, so we might get into a time pinch for the third exam, but if that's the case, then we might not get through all 10 chapters. We'll see how that goes. Um, so 3 exams, 10 chapters per exam. Within those chapters, I'm going to be fairly selective, and this is what I will present in class each meeting. So next time we will cover chapters 1 through 3. So please read chapters 1, 2, and 3 for Wednesday. Hopefully you can get that read before you come into class. In addition to the exams, we're also going to have what did I say? We're also going to have some quizzes, 8 quizzes, and those quizzes are worth. Here it is, right here. We're going to have 8 quizzes worth 20 points apiece, so that is equivalent to 160 points, or 1/4 of your grade. I like that 640 thing for some reason. So 640, 160 points is 1/4 of 640. The quizzes will cover 3 to 4 chapters, and I will specify which chapters on each quiz. So you should be looking for quiz number 1 to pop up pretty quick by the end of this week for sure. The quizzes are going to be due at the time of the exam over which the exam that covers them. So the first quizzes 1 through 3 will be due on the day of the first exam, and quizzes 4 through 6 you do the day of the second exam, and then you only have 2 quizzes for the final exam, so 7 and 8 will be due on the day of the final exam. Those quizzes aren't long. They're going to be worth 20 points. That doesn't mean they're going to have 20 questions, so they may have 10 questions, something like that. They might have 20 questions. It just depends. I'll try not to make it. I'll try to make it. The questions will be of significance. They won't be trivial. You'll have a minute per question to answer them. They will all be multiple choice, true, false. So you don't have to write anything on the quizzes. The quizzes will also, the quiz questions should not be a surprise to you. Okay. The quiz questions, all of them that you will encounter on a quiz, will have been available in the lesson posted to Canvas, the lessons posted within the module. Okay. Following me? So we'll have a module for exam 1. It'll include 10 lessons, each lesson following a chapter. Within that lesson, which covers 1 chapter, I will have a video, in some cases more than 1 video, because I like to link lectures from a previous discussion, and I'll try to show you exactly where you need to look there. You don't have to watch the whole thing necessarily, but I will have what I call study questions. Those study questions are basically open-ended versions of the objective type questions that you will receive on the quizzes. Okay, so the idea here is that I'm gonna show you a lot of study questions, because those are the things I really want you to focus on. You're probably familiar with this, Steve. You have another class of mine, but I want you to focus on those items. You'll be able to find that information in the readings, or in perhaps some other learning content that I'm like a lecture. So if I link, like tonight, I'm going to link a lecture on population, and I want you to watch that. And I'm going to show I will have some questions. Actually, I'll do that tomorrow, but I'll have some questions over that based on that lecture. And when I give you questions based on a lecture, I'll also timestamp where you can find those questions, because I don't like listening to myself, so I'm sure not everybody likes listening to me. But you'll be able to identify, the answer, or at least the idea behind that question within each video. Okay, and it's probably getting a little detailed for you, but we've got readings, we've got video lectures, and then these lectures that we're doing and recording through Zoom. I'll also have those linked in case you need to go back to those. Um, if you all are in class, and you've taken notes and you don't want to hear me twice, that's fine. If you want to study, if you want to access them, you can. The online folks, you can also access them again if you're not here. So um, attendance is kind of optional, but I do appreciate you being here. Okay. Um, so the exams, okay, we have 3 100-point exams. They are going to be, I don't want to say timed, but we're going to have a limit to how much time you have for the exam. Basically, the exams will be available from the time class begins at 5:30 until class ends at 8:25, 8:30. So you have 3 hours to complete your written exams. The exams are worth 100 points. They are not multiple choice or true false like the quizzes. They're not the same questions, but they will be of what I'll call short answer. That is, it might be something like list the 3 so-and-sos, or identify the case in which this was decided, or what is the term that refers to this, that's a possible type of question. And of course, another type of question, well, a few of them are actual essay questions, and most of the time my essays are fairly short essays. So I might ask you to write a couple of paragraphs about something, but it shouldn't be much of a surprise. You're allowed to use notes. Okay. Um, just can't use. You can't have a lawyer in your presence, who is specializing in federal Indian law. I don't want anybody to help you. You need to do your own work. Don't collaborate. But you're certainly welcome to use notes during the exam. The exams won't take the entire time. They shouldn't. So, but you'll have 3 hours in case you really want it, and I'll be here for 3 hours. So. Anyway.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We're taking the exams online. Are they?
Oh yeah, you'll need to bring a computer.
The day?
You'll need to bring a computer.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
yeah.
So we're taking it here.
You're taking it. Well, you don't have to. You don't have to. The online folks will take it online if they. I'm assuming they'll take it online, and that's why I say you can use notes, because I'm not going to use proctoring or anything like that. I've used online proctoring for so long, I'm just totally burned out on it. It only causes problems, in my opinion. But use your own notes, whatever. I mean, I'm hoping you don't hire a lawyer, but if you haven't done the work, it's going to be hard to answer the questions by just trying to get through the book. But I would never assume anybody would do that. All right. So, but if you don't have to come to class necessarily to take the exams, you can take them online if you want. But I'll be here, okay, in case you want to. I won't ask you to be here, but I'll just show up, because that's what I do. All right. So quizzes, exams, I should be able to get your exams back pretty quick. Curving exam scores. This is just a rule of mine. So if I give you a horrible exam and nobody makes better than if the average of 5 people is below 73%, then I'll institute a curve. So maybe the first exam I totally blow it, and the mean is like 55 or something like that. Okay, we'll bring the average up to 73. And so if the mean is 55 but you made an 88, well, you still get those points. Okay, so it shouldn't be too much of an issue. I really don't anticipate much of a curve most of the time. It's there in case we need it. Exam dates, if you have, and I've already had a discussion with one student about conflicts, and I'm happy to work with you to work those obligations out, and there's no penalty for doing that at all. So I'll be happy to work with you on that. If for some reason you don't show up for an exam, I would hope that you would try to get a hold of me and let me know what happened, and you can read that. Bonus, yeah. So at the end of the term, you all have done these online course evaluations. You'll get a link in Canvas for that, and if you would fill that out and send me your proof of purchase or your proof of completion to me, then you'll get an extra 10 points onto your final grade. And that's not the only bonus. If you have if you're able to get your research paper completed and submitted a week before the last day of the class, you get another extra 10 points. So that would be a nice, goal to try to hit, but certainly not necessary if you want that extra 10 days. The final written exam the final deadline is July 30th, which is Friday. Okay. Now we are Monday, Wednesday class, but technically the semester is not over until Friday. You have to take the exam on Wednesday, but as long as you get me your paper uploaded by 11:59 on Friday night, the 30th of July, you're good. And so you have a little bit more time to get that in. That'll be the last thing you do probably, unless you get that 10 points. The other writing assignments are what I call article reviews, and these are designed to get you looking at peer-reviewed articles in academic journals, and those academic journals are going to be different. I'm going to assign one's going to be a legal article, so you'll get a selection of journals to choose from, and those, for example, and you'll have one that'll be from a sort of history, culture journal, and one from a social sciences journal. Okay. And then there's another one, but I can't think of it at the moment. The idea is for you to get a feel for the research. You'll get to select the article you actually read, and then you'll essentially tell me about it. You won't have to actually read the article all the way through. You'll read it like a researcher would read it, or like what we might say a graduate student how they would read it, because articles are produced and written not as casual reading. They're intended to put the facts forward and to make arguments and to demonstrate things. So it's often the case that only a portion, or maybe a few pieces of the article are actually read by a researcher because they're looking for something. Of course, now with search, find a word, you can, with a PDF, you can just search things that are pertinent to what you're looking for. So that's the idea. It's not intended, you'll find, like an article in a scientific journal might be it might have 8 different authors. It could have 20 authors. Who knows? Usually not in this area, but it could have 8 different authors and be all of 4 pages long. But those 4 pages are really dense with information typically. Most of the time they're a little longer than that. But then you'll see maybe like a historical, cultural type of journal. Like one of my favorites is American Indian Quarterly, mostly history, but some anthropology, sociology types of things, some political stuff. And you'll find that those articles are a bit longer, more narrative, easier to read, you know, things that I would actually probably enjoy reading. Um, they might be 20, 25 pages long. And then you'll get the legal journals. Uh, and The legal journals they tend to be really, really long. Like I just pulled up a random one today. I was going to give you an example, but I'm not going to bother with it right here. And the particular, it was from Harvard Law Review. So pretty good publication there. And it was 2021. It was I think it came out in February of this year. And one article by 2 people, had 2 authors, 66 pages long. And you might think, wow, that's a long-term paper, right? But 66 pages sounds like a horrible amount of reading. But it's really not that long, because in legal journals, they typically use footnotes, like the old style footnotes that start below where you read like one paragraph and then there's 3/4 of a page of footnotes. You don't have to read the footnotes, so it actually reads pretty quickly. When I was in graduate school, I loved going to. We had a separate library for the law school, so we had a law library, and it was full of these legal publications, and you could really learn a lot quickly in these legal journals. So anyway, we'll try to get you introduced to some of that stuff. You might find that you want to go into law, or you might find that you're interested in social science, perhaps more than you thought. Anyway, those the size of those article reviews, they're worth 20 points, and I want you to keep them within 2 pages double spaced. So the review needs to be between 250 and 500 words. 250 is my number for a double spaced 12-point font, Times New Roman, 1-inch margin page of text. Okay, 250 words more or less. So 250. So basically 1 to 2 pages. More than 1, less than 2, or at least 1, not necessarily more than 1. And I'll give you a list of, I think it's about 6 or 7 questions that will ask you specific things about that article. Okay, so and it's your job, number one, to find an article that fits the criteria of the assignment. They're all different, so I didn't put them on the syllabus, but you find an article that fits the criteria, or maybe within a particular journal. And if you're like me, you're going to find one, maybe not so long, find something that's interesting to you, and read it, and then basically answer the questions. I'll ask you questions like, okay, first of all, provide a citation for this article, following this example. Secondly, identify the most basic question or research question or problem that this article attempts to address. Number 3, what are the sources of data, et cetera? Or number four, what were the methods that the researcher used to try to address the problem? Okay, so it's pretty basic stuff, and the idea here is to get you into the sort of a variety of academic publications, so you understand what people are doing, all right? And also maybe your interests. I'm just going to ask you to read the awful stuff about plagiarism and penalties and cheating and academic integrity and that sort of thing. If any of you are in the honors program and you want to do an honors contract, I'm open to that. We'll just have to you have to make an A or a B in the class, and then you have to do a little extra work. But I'll be happy to work with you on that. If you hold a letter from the Office of Student Disability Services, let me know discreetly, either by my email or phone or after class, and I'll be more than happy to work with you on any accommodations that might be necessary. I know that giving you a time limit on the writing on the giving you a time limit on the exams could be an issue. We can work through that. And so anyway, overall, the summary of the work in the classes, you have you'll have 8 multiple choice true false quizzes, 20 points apiece, 160 points, 3 exams, 300 points. Final exam is not comprehensive. It's just everything since the second exam. You'll have 4 article reviews, also worth 20 points. So that's 80 points. And then the research paper is going to be worth 100 points. Research paper, maybe backtrack a little bit on that one. Let's see here if you can see that. It'll be, the final paper will be 10 pages or 2,500 words. And that's 10 pages of text, doesn't include the bibliography or the list of references. The main thing I want you to do there is, and this is going to be based all on secondary work. It's based on secondary sources. You don't have to do any research, independent research or anything like that. You don't have to look at archives. Certainly welcome to if you want to. But it's basically going to be a research paper that's going to be dependent on other articles and other sources. So that's why we also want to get you into the academic literature. But the main thing on that for me is that you identify early in the course, as in this week, a topic or 2 or 3 from the textbook that you find really, really interesting and you'd like to pursue that. Or perhaps you're interested in the McGirt versus Oklahoma case and the implications of that. You could go with that as a topic. Or perhaps you're interested in Indian gaming and how that's evolved. Whatever you want to pick it's up to you. And only thing I ask is that we work together in developing your topic so that you don't get off track. And the topic is sort of central to land and Indian country. And it doesn't matter your discipline. I'll help you come up with a topic that probably will fit within your discipline. If you feel totally lost, don't worry about that. That's what I'm here for. Final grade determination is basically a 90%, 80%, 70%, 60%. So you got to get at least 384 points to pass the class. You got to get 576 points to make an A. And you'll actually be able to make up to 660 points. That's how many are actually available with the bonus or extra credit. Incomplete grades or placeholders called incompletes are a lot of students don't even know about these, but I put it on the syllabus. It's if something happens, and this is an 8-week class, and things can happen. I understand that where you could come down with an illness or break a leg or have a child who gets really sick or something like that. Um, if that's the case, don't be afraid to come to me and discuss it. As long as you have 50% of the course completed prior to ending the course and taking an incomplete, um, and you have a legitimate reason, that's fine. But the rule is you have to have 50% of the course completed before you can take an incomplete. Otherwise, I guess they want you to drop the class or something. But anyway, just talk to me and we can work something out like that. And what else did I want to talk about? We've talked about the meaning of the title. We've talked about the 5 sources. Um, Relevant legal terms. I'm gonna probably just direct you to a website that allows you to look things up pretty quickly. If you have a legal dictionary, if by chance you might have one or have access to a legal dictionary, that would be pretty handy also. Um, I think there are a number of legal dictionaries. That is just a dictionary of legal terms. All those Latin terms that you hear lawyers spout out and judges talk about. So it's sometimes useful to have that handy. I'm sure there are websites that also you can online dictionaries for legal terms. All right, so for Wednesday, the chapters are the pre-USA foundations, the early treaty era, and the removal era, and that will take you through about page 60 something, I guess, page 72 actually. So you've got 72 pages worth of reading, but it's actually not quite that many, and it's really fast reading. So, but we're doing double time in this course, right? So it's twice as fast as a regular course.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
Will the quiz be posted?
Yes. That's the first thing I'm going to do tomorrow morning is try to get that thing up. It'll cover chapters 1 through 3. So but also you'll need to look at the pages, which you can't see yet. I haven't actually published them yet, but they'll have the study questions that you'll be looking for those quizzes. And I even put the page number sometimes for the study questions. So, just to make sure. Efficiency is the case. Okay. Now, I just want to make a few points before we wrap up. And these are the points. Earlier I said that, pretty much everything we talk about is going to be relating the United States federal government to the Indian tribal governments or the Indian tribes or nations of people, not so much individual Indian people, although the Bureau of Indian Affairs has to deal directly with American Indian individuals. They have offices in the BIA called individual Indian monies or individual Indian land. So individual Native peoples are part of it, but generally in policy terms, we're going to be just looking at nation-to-nation relationships, sovereign-to-sovereign relationships. And in political geography, we make a distinction between nations and states and the idea of a nation state, which is kind of an ideal. But in a strict or a formal sense, in the United States, we say, we talk about our nation, and we're referring to the United States, to the country, as a political entity. That's okay, but in the formal academic sense, you'll find that when they refer to nation, they're referring to a people, to a group of people who share a common sense of heritage, a common sense of history, or maybe a common sense of destiny. And it's usually wrapped up in a historical experience. Okay, so a nation of people. There's perhaps even maybe even a process that takes place for nations to develop. My colleague Ruel Hanks, who's actually teaching here in the building at the same time on Mondays, is a political geographer who specializes in the former Soviet Union. And one of his long-term research sort of foci, is the process that a lot of the former SSRs of the Soviet Union, like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, etc., how those countries that got their independence when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, how those countries have tried to make a nation, have tried to develop a sense of nationhood for their people. And it's a very difficult process. You can't just do it overnight. Everything, pretty much you go to a library in Uzbekistan, all the books are in Russian, right? Well, as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed in 91, most of the Russians actually booked. They got out of town, right? So it's an interesting process. But, the idea is these countries have sort of consciously tried to create a sense of nation for the people within their countries. And that's sometimes an issue because most of the countries I mentioned, Tajikistan, et cetera, they have multi-ethnic populations. They have a lot of minority groups from neighboring countries, and in addition to the Russian population, who don't want anything to do with that sense of nationhood. The Turkmenistan and the Turkmen want. That's the idea, is that the Turkmen are going to be, the nation for Turkmenistan. The Tajiks that live there don't really care about that, or Kyrgyz. So anyway, the idea of a nation is this sense of people. Now, most American Indian tribes have a strong sense of nationhood. They have a strong sense of culture, and they have shared cultural traits that only they own. So that's important. But a nation in the formal sense is not a territorial entity. The United States, as a political entity, has boundaries, and that is a state. Okay. Now, of course, this gets confusing in the United States because we call ourselves, a bunch of states. We are a bunch of states that are united into a single state. If you go to Europe, though, France, for example, or Belgium. Belgium's a good example. Belgium is a small country, right? So territorially, Belgium is a state, but Belgium is a federal state, and it probably wouldn't even be a country if it weren't for the fact that it was a federal state, because Belgium is divided between two different nations of people. People in the south who consider themselves Walloons, who speak French, are they're Belgian. They live in Belgium, but they don't share the same sense of nationhood with the people in the north of Brussels, who are Flemish and speak kind of a derivative of Dutch, and have a very different, it's sort of like how else are the French speakers different from the Dutch speakers? Well, the French speakers tend to be Catholic, and the Northerners, the Flemish, tend to be, Protestant. So they have a lot of big differences between them, but they share the same state. So a state that has more than one nation occupying it is often referred to as a multinational state. Okay. whether or not the United States is a multinational, I guess if you consider American Indian tribes to be all to be nations, then it would certainly be a multinational state. But the sense of nationhood, and it's hard to weigh. Certainly, certainly Russia today is a multinational state, while Japan probably is about the farthest thing you can get from a multinational state. Japan is very, very culturally homogenous, and has worked to stay that way, frankly. Um, so Japan would be kind of the ideal a state, a territorial state, a country in which all of the people are of the same nation, a nation state. Okay, but most all countries like to call themselves nation states, even though they might be multinational or multi-ethnic. Okay, so a nation state is an ideal. A state is a territorial, and the most important thing here is that well, I guess we can do it here. The most important thing is that states in today's political world, states have governments that possess sovereignty over that territory. Now, if a state is perhaps a federal state, it might be the case that one of the, say, a multinational state that is a federal state might have nations that control certain portions of the state, certain regions or provinces or states or whatever. That's certainly the case. But the central government is going to have sovereignty over that territory. So the United States government, or the people of the United States, are the sovereign and have the sovereignty over the territory. So sovereignty is a difficult word to really understand. I'm going to try to quickly cover a few other points here, and that is we can't get away from the fact that the United States was, as a state, as a country, as a government, was established during a period when European powers were reaching out for the rest of the world, trying to become more powerful to outdo their neighbors in Europe, and creating colonies across the world. And those colonies were, often enterprises designed to produce trade advantages for the mother country. Certainly Virginia, the Virginia plantation, as it was called, Jamestown. The Virginia plantation was a private enterprise by the Virginia Company of London. It really didn't have much to do with the British Crown until it began to fail and the sovereign took it over. It was a business enterprise at first. So the idea was, to find a profitable crop, which eventually they did in tobacco. We'll run into this. So anyway, there are empires, and imperialism is by definition, imperialism is the tendency for empires, or today states, to control their own destiny by controlling what other countries do and how other countries interact. Certainly the United States has gotten into that business, especially in the 20th century, as we began to, really the Spanish-American War was a great example of the United States trying to push its influence over the rest of the world. And then, of course, with World War I, President Wilson, declared that World War I was what? It was the war to end all wars, And how many wars have we fought in the name of democracy, and that sort of thing. So pushing ideas onto the rest of the world is part of this imperial project, or this imperial impulse of some countries. I'll try to skip over some of this real quick. Here's a good one. A couple of important ideas: centripetal forces and centrifugal forces. And just ignore the photos; they're really outdated from an old textbook. The idea of a centripetal force, these is generally referred to the stability of a country or stability of a state, but they can also apply to nations, right? Nations of people. Basically, centripetal forces, if you're familiar with the physics, right? Centripetal forces pull together, right? They are forces that bring people together. Centrifugal forces, like a centrifuge, separate. They spin everything, and they all, the things separate into their component parts. So nations and states all go through a balancing act of centripetal forces and centrifugal forces. Sometimes the centripetal forces are stronger than the centrifugal forces, and that's good for the country or the state in general. Centrifugal forces are sometimes, I guess they could be considered positive as well, perhaps. But those are the things that tend to pull us apart. And I'm old enough now to have witnessed, I think, at least two times, or at least a change from centripetal forces to more centrifugal forces. I think perhaps right now, I don't know, recently, and you've heard this repeated over and over about the polarization of American culture these days. That would in itself be an example of centrifugal forces pulling people apart. Centripetal forces that bring us together, are things like attacks from the outside, like 9/11, for example. Everybody was family after 9/11 happened, right? Because this is an outside force attacking us. But it didn't take very long for us to begin to pull apart. So the United States, just like every other country, goes through these things. It's relevant to American Indian law and policy, though, because the American Indian policy, United States Indian policy, has has taken these swings from promoting or allowing or even promoting tribal autonomy to suddenly deciding that tribes need to go away and American Indian people need to assimilate and just become like everybody else without that national identity. So you'll see this happening through these eras of Indian policy. We don't really need to talk so much about separatism and devolution, but if you take those centripetal and centrifugal forces to an extreme, sometimes you get separatist movements, insurgencies, that sort of thing. There was one last thing I wanted to talk about here. Oh, yeah, here it is. Okay, so here's another point that centripetal forces unify people and centrifugal forces divide people. But and I've already discussed this political spatial organization, so there's not really any sense to bother with that. You keep in mind that the United States is considered a federal state. And if you look at that map, if you can see that, do any of you notice any sort of tendency or pattern among unitary states or federal states? Obviously Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is full of unitary states. Nigeria is a federal state. Hmm? Yeah, the size of the country, the territorially large countries, which we would probably assume are fairly diverse culturally, tend to be federal states, and that's because it's been argued that federal states are sort of an adaptation to a lot of diversity within a country. A federal state allows regions to kind of have their own autonomy, their own identity. So the United States is a federal state. Oh, another point. Unitary states, those unitary states that we're talking about, France is a great example. I love France, but it's still and China's a great example. Saudi Arabia, obviously, a good example. Unitary states typically have it in their best interest to encourage their populace to conform to one culture. All right. So this is why the Chinese right now have these huge work camps where the Muslim populations of Western China, like the Uyghurs and others, who are used to not conforming to Chinese demands, Chinese Communist Party demands. They have millions of these people in these work camps. Basically, they're working as slaves, with the idea, and what the Chinese basically call them sort of like re-education camps. Conform to our ways or else. We're trying to eliminate, and they've tried to eliminate the culture of Tibet for decades and decades, right? France is another example. Even though France is a great democratic country, has even higher ideals really than the United States when it comes to democracy. But yet France has a ministry of language, that is intended to direct and stop change in the French language. They try to keep the language pure. So the idea here is, unitary states often, and France is, France and a lot of other European countries in the last couple of decades have received large numbers of foreign immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa and from the Middle East, from Syria especially, and from Eastern Europe. And those countries have, unlike the United States and unlike a lot of federal states, are not, they don't have a lot of experience in dealing with the issues that come up with a lot of cultural diversity. And so their first inclination is to expect people to conform. Like in France, not so long ago, they passed a law in France that women cannot wear hijab, or they can't wear face coverings or hijabs. That's not because they don't believe in individual freedom of religion. It's because they want people to conform to French ways. Federal states generally don't have those issues, and that's maybe one good thing. That's some good news, perhaps, for American Indian people. Well, that's probably enough.